All right, so in this lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to do a broad stroke on how to create volume metrics, how to render them, how to shade them. We're going to take a look at it in both Mantra and Redshift. We're going to go through the basics of creating volume metrics based on existing geometry, and we'll get into actually shaping them in a later lesson. We're going to talk about voxels, we're going to talk about voxels and how to understand them a little bit better. All right, so to start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just laying down a basic primitive. So I'm just going to go up here to my shelf tool and control click on this box right here. And that'll just create us a default geometry. I'll just call this test volumes. And I'll dive inside of that. So from here, we have a couple different methods that we can start creating volumes with. We have our basic Houdini. There's two different volumes types inside of Houdini. There's the Houdini volumes, and then there's the VDB workflow. The Houdini volume is what we'll start with in this lesson, and then we'll talk about VDB later a little bit later. So to start, what I'm going to do is just drop down an ISO offset. So we'll do tab ISO offset. And then you'll see if we just plug this in here, and then we'll make this visible, we'll get our first volume. So to kind of understand what we're looking at a little bit better, this is going to be what Houdini considers as like a standard polygonal geometry. This right here is going to be a voxels or a Houdini volume. So the big differences between this, if we go up here to our spreadsheet, and then we see this, we go from our box, which has a lot of points on here, and it's got all these different attributes. The volumetric stuff doesn't really work like this. It works with what's called a voxel. And you can think of a voxel as similar to like a pixel on a screen or a pixel on a render. But it's going to be in three dimensions essentially. And the quality of that is going to be controlled by our uniform sampling division. So if I go up here and hit 100, you'll see that the volume gets much more clear. And we can slowly start to see some of this voxel stuff happening here. To make this a little bit more apparent, what I'm going to do is drop down test shape. So I'll do tab and I'll do test. And I'll just go down to the rubber toy. One of the big things when you're working with volumes is you have to understand when you're creating it from geometry, the geometry itself has to be watertight. So if you think of this volume, it looks like it has depth, but these polygons themselves, they're actually flat. And if we can actually dive inside of here and see that. There's no actual thickness to this. Whereas volumetrics, they're going to have thickness to it. But they don't actually have a surface, so that's the big difference too. So if we go from here, if we plug this in here, we'll start to see some of the pixels start to show. If I go back down to something like 10, it's a little bit hard to see now, but what we can do is we can drop down a volume visualization. If you do tab volume, you'll get a big long list of nodes that are going to be working with the volume. So we'll do tab volume visualization. And so we'll just drop down a volume visualization. And if we plug this in, we're going to see something weird happen. Everything kind of disappears. Currently, we have to set up what is called the density field. And currently, we haven't actually given that a name. That's essentially what this is going to be outputting right here. So the Houdini standard is going to be density. And that's what Houdini essentially considers as so whenever we see these values here going from like darkness to some sort of value here, typically the standard is going to be density. There's some other stuff that gets into like pyro simulation, stuff like that, like fire, but we're going to be mostly working with density. So now that I have that name set, and we can come down to our volume visualization, and we go to our density field, and we can come in here and choose density, just like that. And now what we got is essentially a way to control the way this volume works a little bit better. And what we can do is we can come up here to this density scale. And you can think of this as like this, the thickness, how much light is actually going to travel through it. So if I boost this up to something like 100, it's going to be much, much more opaque, so less transparent. And if we plug this into our test geometry, we can start to see this stuff a little bit better. And you can kind of start to see these voxels come into play. It becomes much, much more boxy. And if I come back into my ISO offset, and if I just type in something like 100, we should be able to see this stuff a little bit clearer. So now we can see our voxels right here. So essentially, you can think of this as as pixels that are actually working on 3 different axes. So we have X, Y, and Z. So cool. So let's actually start to render this. So for now, I'm just going to just disable this volume visualization. And what I'm going to do is just drop in some lights. So I'll go ahead and just angle my camera just like this. And then what I'll do is come down here and drop down an area light. So I'll do control click, just like that. And if I rotate around here, we'll start to see that we start to get some sort of shape that's happening here on this. And what I'm going to do is just drop in a fill light. So I got my key light, and then I'll drop my fill light in over here. And I'll control click that. And then what I'll do is on my fill light, what I'm going to do is just make this less intense. So I'll go down to something like 0.2 and jump here and make this something like a blue value, just like that. Something in there. Great. And now we can actually start to render this. So I'll just go ahead and angle this up, and then, whoops. I'll do the same thing. I'll just control click my camera, just like that. And then if we want to move anything around after we've already created the camera or something like that, or the lights, what we do is just hit lock right here. Then we can move around the camera like that. I'm going to go ahead and save this into the project file. So I'll just call this chapter 2, basics volumes. Great, so now we can actually give this a render. So if we go up to our render view, we can just hit render and see what we get. Cool, so we're starting to get somewhere. So at this point, what if I want to actually start to control this a little bit better in terms of density? So right now we did the preview visualization for the volume, but that actually isn't going to communicate with the renderer at all. So we have 2 different options. We can do it on the geometry level, or we can do it on the shader level. So I'll go ahead and show you guys on the geometry level. So on the geometry level, we have a volume mix, which is really, really good for doing small tweaks like this. So volume mix, and then what we can do is go to post multiplication. And what this is going to do is multiply the density volume. So if we just set this something like 20, we notice that our volume becomes much thicker here. But what if we've went through this, we've cached this out to disk already, we know the shape of it's good, but we don't actually control this on the geometry level anymore. And a lot of times the reason why we don't want to do this is because the volumes can get super heavy, and a lot of times you have to proxy them out, just in terms of saving memory and that kind of stuff. So what we want to do in this case is do this on the shader level. So what I'm going to do is go to post multiplication and just change this to 1. I'm going to go to my material palette. What I'm going to do is drop down to our volume shaders, and what I'm going to do is drop in a billowy smoke. I'm just going to drag and drop that into my scene, and then so drag and drop that over here into the material palette, and then what I can do is drag and drop this onto this, and this should work fine if I do this on the render view, but it doesn't give you very good feedback. So if you want to just like change the smoke color to red to make sure it goes on, or what you can do is just cancel out the render, go to scene view, and just drag and drop this, and you should see the yellow highlight right there. Also, if we just select, whoops, it's not selecting. If we just go to our test volumes, what we should see is our material right there. So it's on the geometry load, geometry node under render, and then material. And to get back to our shader, if we actually want to control this, we can just jump by hitting this arrow like that. And then we'll go to render view. We'll just hit render. And then we'll go back here. And then what we can do is same thing that we were doing on the geometry level, on the SOPs level. What we can do is just the smoke density, which is right here. So we can just boost this up to a value of 20. Just like that. Cool. And then from there, of course, we have things like our color that we can change, all of that. Shadow density value. So if you want to actually keep the same thickness, but you want light to go through it a little bit better, that's a really good way to do it. So it makes it feel like very translucent. Great. So now what if we actually just want to render this inside of Redshift instead of Mantra? I'm going to go ahead and cancel this out. I'm going to save this. I'm just going to save this out as Redshift because we're going to clear some of this out. So to set this up with Redshift, what we're going to need to do is go ahead and clear out a lot of these renders. So we're going to clear out the lights. We're going to go down to the output. We're going to clear out the Mantra node. And we're going to go over to the material palette as well and clear out the billowy smoke. What we are going to do is jump back into, actually we'll just come up here to our Redshift tab. So if we just hit this little plus icon right here, we can get to our shelves. So we go shelves, then we jump down to Redshift right here. I already have it enabled, so I'm just going to leave it enabled, just like that. And then we'll just control click our Redshift icon right here, which will drop in our render nodes. And then we can go ahead and hit the Redshift render view. And we can see that we start to render. So Houdini does support Houdini's native volumes now and everything like that. But to actually start to rendering this, there's some quirky default values with the lights that we have to set up. So I'm just going to go to Redshift, and then I'm going to drop down a RS light. And then what we do is just come up here to a little bubble icon right there and just go down to look through light. Then we do RS light, and we'll make sure the lock icon is on right there. Then we'll just zoom out just like this. Great. We can jump back to our camera. And then if I just jump into my render view again, we'll see something very interesting happening. And what is happening is that Redshift doesn't actually light volumetrics by default. It doesn't actually, the lights don't actually emit volume rays. So if we go to the object level and go down to RS light, we'll need to go to our light tab over here and then go down to volume contribution scale. And what we'll do is just set this to a value of 1. Be careful with this. Setting to a value of 1 is just basically saying, okay, affect the volume metrics the same exact way you affect everything else in your scene. And it's really, really easy to start doing this kind of stuff where you want it to be a little bit thicker. And you start to tweak things here. I wouldn't do that because it can be very problematic. In my experience in production, it's important to keep the lights very, very consistent and have things kind of cooperate on a shader level, which will make things a lot more consistent down the road. So in Redshift, how do we tweak the density volume? So if we want to make it thicker, for example, what I'm going to do is drop down. I'm going to go into the shop level. I'm going to drop in an RS volume. And then I'm going to just drag and drop this onto our object right here. And now this is the node that we're going to be working with. So this can be a little difficult when you're starting with tweaking this stuff. Generally speaking, like if you play with the scatter coefficient, really what we want is a the big problem with this scatter, I'm not going to pretend to know how to pronounce that, coefficient, I think it's called, is that when you make it thicker, you also make it brighter, which is not what you want. That's not really how the density stuff works on the Mantra side, and it's really kind of problematic. So what I like to do is I like to just make these the absorption value and the scatter coefficient value the same value. And that kind of keeps things in time. It keeps things working a little bit closer to Mantra. And also to kind of make this a little bit easier, what I do is I'll right click and copy this. So I'll copy parameter, and then I'll do paste relative references. And what that's going to do is just link those up so that we don't have to worry about that anymore. We can just, come in here, we can hit play to render, then we can come in here and, we say 3, 2, 1, and we're doing what we're expected to see. It's just like an opacity control at this point. We just want it to be thicker without having to worry about actually making them actually having to balance this stuff. So it's a little bit easier to work with. Cool. So one last thing before we get off, I want to just briefly talk about lookup tables. So on the Redshift side, what we do is we actually use the settings knob here. But first what I want to do is just make sure that I'm going to kind of over crank the lights here. So I'm just going to go into my lights and then go to shader, and then I'll just boost up the exposure. I'll just double that up. So now we get this super bright volumetric. And what's super important, not just in volumetrics, but any rendering circumstances, it's important that you render in a using a lookup table. So to apply that in Redshift, what we do is we go over to our little gear icon right there, little settings right there. We'll switch our display mode over to linear, and then we'll turn on lookup table. And what we're going to do is we're going to convert to log space before applying the LUT, and then we're going to apply a LUT. And Redshift itself comes with a ton of LUTs. And immediately what you can see is when you turn those on, the highlights immediately become soft clipped. So it not only looks really, really bright, and we get this really photographic look. So super essential. I'm going to go ahead and save this out, and we'll just fire back up the Mantra. And now with our Mantra render, what we're going to do is we're jumping to render view, and we'll just go ahead and hit render. I'm going to go to my area light and just make sure that we kind of overcrank this with exposure or intensity, just to kind of show you why we need to do this. I'll hit stop, and what I'll do here is I'll go down to my little options down here in my render view. So I'll hit this little triangle, which will pop up the settings. And what we want to do is just set this to a gamma of 1 right there. So we got our linear. This is sRGB. This is linear. And then what we'll do is we'll right click, load LUT, and then we'll go into our project settings, miscellaneous, and we'll choose this Kodak film LUT. This is something I'm shipping with the project file, so you should have access to it. So boom, there we have it again. This really nice, soft, really photographic look that comes with the lookup table. Okay, great. So that wraps it up for this lesson. What we'll do in the next lesson, we'll start talking about how to create more complex volumes.